All rise, we will obey. Please be seated.
Yes, Ms. Harbour.
Good morning, Your Honors. During the next hour, I will address the two remaining categories of contributions. First, the accused's 3 special units, and second, the accused's network of training camps. Then I will begin our submissions on the charged crime bases, discussing Krajina during this session. First, the accused's 3 Serbian DB units. Stanišić and Simatović made significant and deadly contributions through 3 units. I draw your attention to the slide. The unit they formed for this purpose in May 1991, whose insignia is in the center. The Serbian Volunteer Guard, commanded by fellow JCE member Arkan, and the insignia is on the left. And the Scorpions, which the accused co-opted in 1993. Their insignia is on the right. In their briefs, both accused attempt to distance themselves from these units, but these attempts fall flat. Overwhelming evidence establishes that Stanišić and Simatović had authority over all 3 units and determined when and where they deployed, invariably committing brutal crimes targeting non-Serbs. If we could have the next slide, please. The unit, SDG, and Scorpions all had the Serbian State Security Services emblem built into their insignia, an upright sword with 4 Cyrillic S's. The same insignia displayed behind the accused on the wall at the unit's Kostic Center, as your honors can see from the image on the slide. I'm going to discuss the accused's authority over each of these units in turn. First, the unit. Responding to Milosevic's call in March 1991 for appropriate formations to defend Serb interests outside of Serbia, the accused formed the unit so that they could use it in ethnic cleansing operations on the 4th of May, 1991. Your honors will be very familiar with Franko Simatovic's speech giving the history of the unit at its base, the Rade Kostic Center in Serbia, at a ceremony in 1997. And I'll play a clip for your honors.
Mr. President, we thank you for accepting the invitation to attend the ceremony marking the anniversary of the formation of the Special Operations Unit of the State Security Service. It was constituted on 4 May 1991 at the time of breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and since it emerged has worked to protect national security in circumstances where the Serbian people was directly jeopardized throughout its entire combat operations.
At paragraph 806 of his brief, Simatović asserts that no other evidence admitted in this case supports his own words that the unit was established on the 4th of May, 1991. But Serbian DB personnel files reflect that the Serbian DB itself and original unit members considered their membership in the unit to commence from their training at Golubic and considered the 4th of May to be the anniversary date of the unit. This is at paragraphs 108 to 109 of our brief. And I'd ask for the next slide, please. As an example, your honors will see on the slide coming up both accused argue that there was no unit that existed and operated under their authority from May 1991 through 1995. Simatović argues that there was no unit until the JATD was formalized in August 1993. And even then, he was not involved with it. The accused arguments run contrary to voluminous evidence proving the unit's continuous existence under their control. The accused enlisted Captain Dragon to help them create the unit, and I will let your honors hear his own words on a video.
The unit existed at all times, formally or informally, whether with 15 people in it or 300 at the end. I commanded the unit in one period, Frankie in another, Legia in yet another, but the unit existed at all times.
Stanišić argues at paragraph 32 of his brief that 5 indicia of consistency would prove that the unit existed and operated continuously as the same unit from 1991 through 1995. The indicia are consistency of command, function and purpose, membership, self-identification, and identification by others. Now, these are obviously not a legal test, your honors, but I'd like to take a look at them. First, consistency of command. Numerous witnesses, including individuals who were part of the unit during the indictment period, and others in a position to know, testified that Stanišić and Simatović had authority over the unit and decided when and where they would deploy, and exercised exclusive control over them. To take just a few examples, if I could have a slide. On the slide that's coming up, you will see a November 1991 request for proof of membership in the Special Purpose Unit Platoon deployed in Lezhimir. And handwritten on the top is DB, and Frankie should sort this out. If I could have the next slide, please. This is a unit member's statement to the Knin Soup in 1993. The unit member states, I came to Ilok in April 1992 to the Paizosh camp. I was under Frankie's command. The next slide is from a witness who is a unit member in 1995. He said, quote, at the time, we were called the Red Berets, or Frankie's men, after our commander at the time, Frankie Simatović. Frankie personally reported to the chief of the State Security Department, Jovica Stanišić, as far as I know. And I direct your honors to rows B1 through 3 of the evidence table for additional examples from confidential evidence. The next indicia of consistency that Stanišić raises is consistency of function and purpose. The unit was established to implement the accused's common criminal purpose by committing crimes against non-Serbs to drive them out of targeted areas of Croatia and Bosnia, and to train other Serb forces so they could do the same. And we note at paragraph 924 of our brief that right from the beginning, the accused welcomed known criminals into the unit. The unit recruited criminals because that suited the unit's purpose, to remove non-Serbs through crimes. As Stoparić testified, when he was recruited into the unit in 1995, the Serbian DB member doing his intake expressly told him that it would be okay if he had a criminal conviction. And as we will detail in addressing specific crime bases, the unit consistently targeted non-Serb civilians in their deployments, beginning with the earliest operations in Krajina, which Simatović planned and commanded himself, and throughout 1991, in Krajina, SBWS, even into the RSK after combat operations had all but ceased, and again in Bosnia, in Bosanski Shamac, Brčko, Doboj. They rounded up, they arrested and detained non-Serb civilians. They murdered, they raped, and violently tortured them. And this continued throughout the indictment period. The unit was consistent in function and purpose. The third indicia Stanišić posits is consistency of membership. Simatović selected the original unit members at Golubic, and at paragraph 55 of his brief, Stanišić concedes that these very individuals were the ones that he made the core of what he calls the Nascent unit. When the accused celebrated the success of their unit at the Kostic Center in 1997, unit member Živojin Ivanović, Žika Crnogorac, introduced President Milosevic to the, quote, veterans of the 1st Special Operations Unit of the Republic of Serbia, State Security. And witness and documentary evidence, including Serbian DB personnel files, document the veterans' continued progression through the unit during the indictment period. This is at rows B5 through 7 of the evidence table. Consistency of self-identification is the next indicia. Throughout the indictment period, unit members presented themselves as members of a special unit commanded by Simatović and understood that Stanišić was their overall commander. Contemporaneous records and personnel files show that the unit members considered themselves members of the same unit from the date that they joined, notwithstanding changes in the unit's name. This is at rows B8 and 9 of the evidence table. In 1991, to be the same as his unit in December 1995. And by the way, Stanišić actually agrees at paragraph 54 of his brief that statements of allegiance to the Serbian MUP in the personnel files, which predate September 1991, show some consistency of self-identification. The consistency of self-identification is also evident in the unit's stamps, and I ask for the next slide to be shown, please. As you can see from the slide, from left to right, it's the unit's stamp from the JPN period, 1991 to 1992, the JATD period, August 1993 onward, and the JSO period from 1996. The seals are identical, but for the change in the name and acronym. On the fifth and final indicia that Stanišić posits is consistency of identification by others. Now, of course, this has to be considered in light of the fact that this was a secret unit, and the accused went to great lengths, of course, to conceal the unit's existence and affiliation, both with themselves and with the Serbian DB. This is paragraphs 52 to 56 and 118 of our brief. Even so, during joint operations, Serb forces knew the unit as Franki's men, Frankijevci, and the accused made sure that those they worked with to further the common criminal purpose knew the unit was under their control. When Serb authorities needed the unit's assistance, they specifically met with the accused or their immediate subordinates, knowing that the accused dictated where they would deploy. This is at row B10 through 11 of the evidence table. Let me turn now to specifically address Stanisić's nascent unit argument. According to this theory, Stanišić attempted to create a unit at the Lezhimir and Paizoš camps between September 1991 and March 1992, and ordered this unit disbanded in March 1992. A very convenient theory, placing Stanišić out of command when the unit deployed to participate in ethnic cleansing operations in Doboj, Bosanski Shamac. Leaving aside for a moment its absurdity, this theory involves a number of concessions. At paragraph 55 of his brief, Stanišić acknowledges that he took temporary command of around 28 men selected by Simatović in September 1991 to create the nascent anti-terrorist unit. Stanišić is thus not challenging that he had the authority to create and control the Serbian DB unit prior to his official appointment as Serbian DB chief in 1992. Stanišić is also accepting that his subordinate, Simatović, was sufficiently involved in the Golubic training camp that he was able to identify and select the men for Stanisić's unit. This must mean that Stanišić was either aware of and involved in Simatović's process for selecting the men, or that he trusted Simatović's judgment for the selection. Either way, Stanišić taking temporary command of the unit members Simatović selected requires coordination and shared trust between the two accused. This undermines any suggestion that Simatović was on a frolic at Golubic, and also undermines any suggestion that either accused were simply conducting intelligence gathering. I'd like to focus for a moment on the idea that the unit was disbanded in March. First of all, Stanišić does not cite any evidence that he gave an order to disband the unit. Not a single document, not a single witness. He agrees in paragraph 64 that there are a handful of documents reflecting the unit's continued existence after March 1992. According to Stanišić, his most salient evidence of this disbanding is 2D00143, a 1994 report by the later JATD assistant commander and Stanisić's witness, Krasmanović. This report is important and it is reliable, but it does not show that the unit disbanded. At most, it shows that it reduced its presence in Paizoš for a period of time. But the most significant thing about this report is that it makes clear that there was no change to the unit until after the corridor operations, which included the Bosanski Shamac and Doboj operations, as Simatović also points this out at paragraph 518 of his brief. Thus, Stanišić, relying on this document and his nascent unit theory, was in command of the unit when they were committing the charged crimes in Bosnia. Contrary to Stanisić's claim at paragraph 64 of his brief, unit members did not switch allegiance to the RSK MUP in mid-1992, but rather there was a nominal change in affiliation to circumvent the Vance Plan's demilitarization requirement. And this is fully addressed at paragraphs 118 to 122 of our brief. I've barely scratched the surface of the evidence here today. For the nascent unit theory to be true, the chamber would have to find that the documentation contained in the Serbian DB and BIA's archives on the unit members was fabricated before it was seized by the ICTY, that the prosecution's insider witnesses, including unit members and others who interacted with them, gave false testimony, that Stanišić defense witnesses also gave false testimony, that the interviews provided during the unit documentary, which is P59, were fabricated, and that Simatović's speech at the Kostic Center ceremony was intentional disinformation fed to the accused's ultimate superior, Milosevic, that Milosevic accepted these lies without any follow-up measures or consequences for the accused, and in fact promoted Simatović afterward, and that the extensive evidence corroborating this speech, some of which is set out in Annex B to the Annex B to the prosecution's brief, was either coincidence or also fabricated. And I refer your honors to row B12 of the evidence table. During the Kostic Center ceremony, after presenting the awards, Stanisić's closing remarks are telling. He states, "We have now actually given out the greatest, the highest awards that can be earned in work of this kind, and these are awards for valor. Each one of them is the same, particularly the way it came about, but in essence, it speaks of the heroism of our people and what we have put into our unit." Our unit. Stanišić clearly wasn't talking about any great heroism that the JSO displayed in Serbia after the war had ended. He was obviously referring to and accepting his own responsibility for, and even applauding his unit's actions during the indictment period. I'll now turn to Arkan's Serbian Volunteer Guard. Both accused have challenged any connection between the SDG and themselves, but their arguments are unconvincing. The evidence in this case proves that the SDG operated under the accused, that the accused played a decisive role in when and where they would deploy, and with the Serbian MUP, ensured that they were adequately equipped and funded for their deployments. And this is paragraphs 162 to 185 of the prosecution brief. By the end of the war, the VJ security organ had concluded that the SDG under Arkan was one of the units that had been, quote, engaged under the guise of special units of the RDB or the MUP since 1991. That's P849, page 2. The CIA reported that the SDG was, quote, an elite, well-trained paramilitary unit equipped and controlled by the RDB, which allows the Serbian government to deploy a capable combat force to Bosnia and Croatia in a crisis period without overt Serbian intervention. That's P852, page 11. At paragraph 636 of his brief, Stanišić appears to concede that the DB had some relationship with the SDG in 1995. In fact, from 1994, Stanišić and Simatović deployed the SDG alongside the unit and Scorpions continuously without interruption until the war was over. Although Simatović personally coordinated these SDG deployments and was in frequent contact with Arkan during each operation. This is B15 at the evidence table. Although Simatović's witness, Stojan Novaković, one of the original SDG members, testified that Arkan never met with Simatović, the prosecution impeached him with exhibit P3860. This is a VRS report reflecting that on 19 September 1995, quote, Mr. Frankie and Božović from the MUP of the Republic of Serbia and Željko Ražnatović, aka Arkan, on one side, and with RS officials on the other, they agreed on an operation for Arkan and the SDG in the RS. Simatovic's position on Archon's side of the table, negotiating Archon's assignment, reflects a pre-existing relationship of authority. Thanks to ties to the Serbian DB and Serbian MUP, the SDG could freely cross borders with arms. And I'd like to go into private session, Your Honors.
Private session.
We're back in open session, Your Honors.
Stanišić argues that there was no relationship between the Serbian DB and the SDG from 1991 through 1994. That's paragraph 636 of his brief. However, the accused authority over the SDG and the Serbian DB's institutional links with Archon did not spontaneously develop at the end of the war. They were a continuation of the accused relationship of authority over the SDG from the earliest operations in SBWS in 1991 and in Bosnia in 1992. This is at row B20 of the evidence table. Both accused agree that JCE member Bogdanović had close ties to Archon. Contrary to the defense arguments that these ties undermine the accused's authority over the SDG, the evidence shows that the accused worked closely with Bogdanović to provide early support for Archon and the SDG. Bogdanović and both accused were active in the Vojna Linija, along with Archon, arming Serbs and preparing paramilitaries from the inception of the indictment period. This is at paragraphs 69 and 164 of our brief. Stanišić argues at paragraph 639 of his brief that given Archon's relationship with Bogdanović and Baja, any reference in the evidence to support by the Serbian MUP must be presumed to refer to them or their agents and not to the accused. But there's a timing problem with this argument. Bogdanović undoubtedly maintained close ties with Archon and supported him pursuing the common criminal purpose together throughout the indictment period. But Bogdanović was no longer the Serbian MUP minister as of June 1991. After he stepped down, as Vasiljević testified, real power within the Serbian MUP at the time resided with Stanišić. Professionally, Stanišić was the dominant figure, even before he was officially head of the DB. And this is row B21 of the evidence table. As for Baja, a witness testified that Baja did not meet or become close to Archon until later that autumn. This is row B22 of the evidence table. The Serbian MUPs and Serbian DB's institutional links to Archon went through Stanišić. During this intervening period, when neither Bogdanović nor Baja were plausibly positioned to be Archon's primary connection to the Serbian MUP, before Archon even deployed to the SBWS, Archon informed prosecution witness Borivoje Savić that it was Stanišić he worked for. And this is at the evidence table, row B23. The Simatović defense argues that Archon's relationship was with the federal DB, not the Serbian DB. As Stanišić acknowledges in his brief, paragraph 639, Archon's affiliation with the federal DB ended in 1991. The Serbian MUP under Bogdanović, and specifically the Serbian DB under Stanišić, took Archon over from the federal DB, knowing he was a criminal, and then continued deploying him and supporting him until the end of 1995. This is row B24 of the evidence table. The fact that Archon was under the continuous monitoring of the Serbian DB from 1991 through 1995 certainly demonstrates that the accused were well informed of the activities of Archon and the SDG. And I refer your honors to the details in Simatović's brief from paragraphs 1067 to 1085. This continuous surveillance does not undermine the evidence that the accused exercised authority over the SDG, nor the evidence that the accused shared the common purpose with Archon as a fellow JCE member. Simatović defense witnesses, Milan Milošević and Radivoj Micić, confirmed that the Serbian DB regularly monitored collaborators and people they worked with. This is row B25 of the table. If anything, the continuous surveillance described in detail by Stanisić's own witnesses renders the accused policy of protecting the SDG and repeated deployment of the SDG into operations where they committed crimes all the more shocking to the conscience. I will now turn to the Scorpions, and if I could have the next slide on the screen, please. This is the third unit that the accused used. The prosecution does not dispute that the group that became the Scorpions was founded in 1991 or 1992 to protect oil fields, as both accused submit. However, Stanišić credibly testified that in 1993, that unit was brought under the patronage of the Serbian DB. And that is when they were named the Scorpions, the name that appears on their insignia under the Serbian DB sword, as your honors can see on the far right insignia on the slide. As your honors can see, the Scorpions insignia is virtually identical to that of the unit in the center. Both defense argue that the Scorpions were a unit of the SVK under General Lončar. Stanišić testified that while this was nominally true, the SVK did not have actual authority over them. And the Serbian DB's own reporting in February 1995 stated that in terms of establishment, Medic's battalion forms part of the Corps. However, no one doubts its independence. And that's P815. Defense and prosecution evidence alike put Milan Milanović Mrgud squarely in the Scorpions command chain over Botza. And this is at B27 of the evidence table. The accused transmitted orders for the Scorpions through Mrgud. And some of the evidence documenting his association with the Serbian DB, I will go through now. Stanišić testified that Mrgud was an indisputable DB collaborator. If I could have the slide on the screen, please. Savić testified that Mrgud, quote, was the state security man in Erdut. It was no secret. The DB pulled his strings, and he didn't even hide it. The CIA reported on 12 October 1995 that, quote, the RDB considers Milanović to be completely under its control. Milanović even calls Serbian RDB chief Jovica Stanišić chief. And finally, a VJ report from June 1995 states, Mrgud goes to Belgrade to report to the MUP of Serbia, Jovica Stanišić. And I note that this was the month the Scorpions deployed to Trnovo. Stanišić testified that when he quit the Scorpions after the Trnovo deployment, he was immediately recruited by a Serbian DB member who told him that, quote, all the good people should be in one special unit. And in fact, while the accused briefs strongly disavow these units, as soon as the war was over, they welcomed members of the Scorpions and the SDG into the unit, the ultimate seal of approval for their crimes. Your Honors, I will now turn to the last category of contributions that we will be addressing, which is the accused's role in establishing training camps to train and arm Serb forces across the indictment area. According to Stanišić, the prosecution should be required to show that a clear pattern of crime arose as a result of and due to the training received. And this is paragraph 292 of Stanisić's brief. As is evident from our brief and our submissions today, that is precisely what occurred. Beginning with the Golubic training camp in April 91, the accused and unit members under their authority established an extensive network of training camps to train Serb forces. The camps were intended and used for the common purpose. This is clear from their proximity to the planned ethnic cleansing operations into which the newly trained Serb forces were deployed, as depicted on the next series of slides. If I could get the slides, please. As your honors can see from this slide, the camps the accused established in Krajina, and you can see the operations that they fed into. On the next slide, the Lezimir camp in Serbia and the operations in SBWS. Next, the Pajzoš camp, and from the Pajzoš camp, they deployed into Bosanski Shamac, right across the border in Bosnia. Next, from Mount Ozren and Doughboy camps, they deployed into the Posavina corridor. And next, from camps in eastern Bosnia and Mount Tara in Serbia, they deployed into the scorched earth operations in the Podrinja. This, for the evidence, your honors can see the table row B31. While the accused would have the chamber believe that the training consisted only of basic defensive military skills, as Stanišić says in numerous paragraphs in his brief, it is clear that the training prepared Serb forces to commit crimes during offensive, criminal operations, expelling the non-Serb population. From the very outset at Golubic, the training began with indoctrination, what Babic called brainwashing, to prioritize the Serb national interest above all else. Your honors have heard evidence that trainees at Mount Ozren learned how to use human shields and were indoctrinated with the belief that they had to remove all Muslims from the area. Whilst at Pajzoš, your honors have heard evidence that training covered silent liquidations and being trained to take over houses. This is at row B32 of the evidence table. If I could have the next slide, please. During the Kostic Center ceremony, Simatović boasted of the unit's successes and enormous contribution to combat operations at 50 locations. Could the slide be brought to the screen, please? This next slide has Stanišić proudly showing Milosevic a topographical map hung on the wall of the Kostic Center that marks the locations of the training camps with wolf heads. And in the next slide, you'll see a close-up, and your honors will recognize many of the locations from this case. It was not only unit members who made an enormous contribution to operations, but also the thousands of troops they trained throughout the indictment period at the accused training camps. This amplified the accused's training contribution exponentially. And I'll direct your honors to the evidence at row B33. In this regard, I'd like to address Simatovic's argument at paragraph 335 of his brief that the only unit at Golubic in May 1991 was a Krajina MUP unit under Dragan Karna, which predated the accused and Captain Dragon's arrival in the region. The prosecution does not dispute that an intervention unit under Karna was based at Golubic. The evidence is clear that Karna went on to be among the first group of trainees at Golubic, and then one of the first commanders within the structure that Simatović created, and that after the training, he remained a commander of a unit of Martić's Krajina police and participated in further ethnic cleansing operations in Kijevo and in the Posavina corridor and other places. So this is actually a classical example of the accused training system at work. And I'll direct your honors to row B34. Your honors, I'm now going to transition from the accused's significant contributions to address you on the charged crime base in Krajina. And I will start by addressing you on Captain Dragan Vasilković, who also used the pseudonym Daniel Snedin, the charismatic mercenary commander who Stanišić and Simatović recruited to be their associate. And they used him to command the unit and other Serb forces in the earliest ethnic cleansing operations in Krajina, as well as Baranja and Slavonia in 1991, and to further train and use Serb forces for crimes in Bosnia. This is at row B35. The accused have spent considerable parts of their briefs denying any authority over Captain Dragan. Simatović's attempt to downplay his relationship with Captain Dragan as that of an intelligence officer with a subject of operational processing conveniently ignores the vast majority of documentary evidence unequivocally proving Simatović's authority over and close working relationship with Captain Dragan. Stanisić's weak attempt to discredit evidence of the accused's relationship with Captain Dragan is equally unconvincing and ignores the corroboration of a large body of evidence, documentary and insider witnesses. Let me begin with the contemporaneous accounts by Simatović and Captain Dragan themselves. And I'd like to play a video of Captain Dragan.
I think that I left a deep impression with them during that conversation. They asked me how and what I wanted to do. And I told them what I want to do. They asked me how I was planning to do that. I told them everything about it. Then they asked me if I could put it down. Of course, I put it all down. A short 21-day course, roughly speaking. And that is when I became friends with Frankie, in a way. It went much further than that official conversation.
That was Captain Dragan. Now I direct your honors to Exhibit P-1961, a record that Simatović prepared in April 1991. In April, Simatović stated that a meeting was held with Daniel Snedin in order to discuss his further engagement pursuant to the plan presented to him during the last meeting. The accused have pointed to Captain Dragan's interactions with prominent figures outside of the Serbian DB as evidence that he could not have been acting under the accused's authority. But these arguments ring hollow in view of documentation from the defense organs acknowledging Captain Dragan's ties with and obligations toward the Serbian DB. P-1962, for example, is the minutes of a conversation between Captain Dragan and the Minister of Defense in Serbia, Tomislav Simović, where he states that, the minutes state that the Serbian DB invited him, referring to Captain Dragan, to our country. He collaborated with Stanisić and Radmila Bogdanović. And Simović's personal assistant confirmed this in her book, noting at Exhibit P-3755, page 31, that, quote, the phenomenon of Captain Dragon was created by the SDB. Further evidence demonstrates that Captain Dragon continued to work for the accused throughout 1991, and I refer your honors to row B37 for a few striking examples. In early August, Stanišić himself confirmed to Babić that Captain Dragon was in their service. This is row B38. In early November 1991, Captain Dragon confirmed that he had, quote, obligations towards the state security service, or towards the state security of the Republic of Serbia, and that his activities had to be, quote, fully in accordance with the mentioned service. And this is in row B39. The Simatović defense's lengthy analysis of Captain Dragon relies heavily on the misconception that the Serbian DB's surveillance of Captain Dragon precludes him from being their associate. But as I have already pointed out with respect to Arkan, credible defense witness evidence is that the DB regularly monitored the people that they worked with. Your honors, I will now address you on the accused role and liability for operations and charged crimes in Krajina from summer 1991. From summer 1991, the accused and fellow JCE members deployed Serb forces they trained at Golubic and other training camps in targeted attacks against Croat villages throughout the Krajina, with the aim of forcibly displacing the non-Serb population. And Simatović was personally involved in planning and commanding some of these early operations, and continued to deploy the unit and coordinate other Serb forces in the brutal ethnic cleansing operations led by the JNA beginning in late August 1991. I will not address all of the operations, but I will say a few words now on Simatović's role in Operation Žauka and the attack on Glina in July 1991, and in the Lovinac attacks in August and September 1991. And then I will address your honors on the JNA-led operations from late August through the end of 1991. The evidence supporting Simatović's leading role in the July 1991 attack on Glina is voluminous and clearly set out at paragraphs 345 through 348 of our briefs. It includes contemporaneous reports sent directly to Frankie by Captain Dragon, SAO Krajina TO, and others in the lead up to the attack, referring to the unit's training to prepare forces at the Shamarica camp. It also includes the unit members' own reports in July about the attack. Simatović himself confirmed his affiliation with the unit in an exhibit at Exhibit P-843, where he indicated that, quote, a part of the special unit from Glina has returned, and we are writing a report. And his initials are visible on the document. Your honors have numerous reports from the SAO Krajina TO and in July and August that show a dual chain of reporting to SAO Krajina authorities and Serbian authorities, and they are all addressed to the highest civilian and military command authorities within the SAO Krajina: the President of the National Defense Council, the Secretary of the SUP, the Commander of the TO, and Frankie. The prosecution's military expert Tunins explained unequivocally that inclusion in the addressee list of this kind of situational report indicated a need to know for decision making. And that's at row B43 of the evidence table. Now, contrary to what Stanišić alleges, this attack was not defensive action, but was initiated by unit members who were ordered to simulate an attack by Croatian MUP on the JNA. And this is at paragraph 346. But more importantly, the Serb forces targeted churches, houses, a school, a veterinary station. By the end of 1995, at least 84.7% of the pre-war Croat population was displaced from Glina, and most of them left in June and July 1991. I refer your honors to row B44 of the table. I'll now turn to the attacks on Lovinac in August and September 1991. If we could have the slide, please. Simatović predictably denies any involvement in the attack on Lovinac. First, he argues that the initials on P217 on the screen are not his. Now, this document is entitled Putting into the Effect the Project on Armored Vehicles, and it's dated 21 June 1991. It proposes the creation of an armored train that would have the capability to target and attack Lovinac. Simatović claims that the document is written in the Ikavian dialect, which Simatović would not have used. But since there's no evidence on what Simatović would have done or how he would have signed documents, whether others would have typed them for him, Simatović's arguments are pure conjecture. Secondly, he claims that the stamp contains a Croatian checkerboard emblem, which would not have been used in Knin in June 1991. Now, two defense witnesses confronted with the smudge at the bottom of the page described it as blots and dots, and the chamber is perfectly placed to examine these blots and dots for itself. This is no basis for dismissing the authenticity of the document. And finally, Simatović relies on his graphology expert, Krstić, to assert that the initials are not his. However, Krstić's evidence was that he could not assess the signature on this page. A comparison of the initials on this document with Simatović's initials on other documents leaves no doubt that he signed this one. And for that, I refer your honors to Annex F of the prosecution brief. And moreover, other credible evidence demonstrates that the armored train used in the Lovinac attack was constructed on Simatović's request. This is at row B45. I have one final note about Lovinac. Both accused have argued that the objectives of the Lovinac attacks were military. This is plainly inaccurate. The purpose of the attacks was to expel the non-Serb population. During the first attack, Simatović used the armored train to, quote, intimidate people and drive them to leave the area, as one witness put it. And as another witness put it, quote, put psychological pressure on the population. This is at row B48. During the second attack, the unit led by Simatović set Lovinac on fire and looted it. These tactics proved successful, as the demographic numbers for Lovinac show that by the end of 1995, at least 74.3% of the pre-war population, Croat population, had left Lovinac, most of whom left in August and September 1991. Simatović himself confirmed in September 1991 that he had razed it all. Your Honors, with the minute I have, I could turn to the post-August operations, or we could take a break.
I suppose if it's convenient to break it this time so that we don't spill over. So we'll come back at 1:07.
All rise. We will away.